Right. Well, I think we're ready with the camera. Just so everyone knows, we will be filming this, so there'll be a copy available later on if you want to show it to anybody. But without further ado, good evening, my lords, ladies and gents. Thank you for being here this evening at the Taxpayers Alliance for a debate on the future of the House of Lords. My name is James Roberts. I'm the political director here at the TPA, and I'll be chairing the debate this evening. So, I must start off by saying that I'm aware that not everybody is as interested as we in this room are in the future of the House of Lords. So the intention, it's unbelievable, isn't it, Howard? So the intention of the debate this evening is to try and change that a little bit and try and showcase some of the interesting and fascinating proposals that are on offer for the future of the Lords. Now, the debate this evening is going to be in a slightly different format than some of you may be used to. We're going to be trying to do it in a bit more of a quick-fire format. What that means is that we'll start off by going round the panellists and giving them a few minutes each to outline their proposals. Once we've done that, I'll then go back round the panel again and give them 2 minutes or so to comment on the proposals that they've heard. We'll then go over to you, the audience, to prod and probe and question and ask them any questions you like about their proposals. We'll do that for about 30 minutes, and then I'll close proceedings and we'll have a vote, just a simple show of hands, to pick our winner for this evening. So in short, ladies and gents...
STV on first past the post.
Trust you, Trust you, Roberto.
So this is a bit with simple show of hands, and then we can argue about the true winner later on. I will ask you to vote though on the basis of the arguments you've heard this evening. So try and put your preconceptions to one side. This, in short, ladies and gents, is a bit like a political dragon's den. Only you are the dragons, and well, they're the den, I suppose. So over to our brave speakers. I'll introduce them one by one. First, to my right, Sir Henry Bellingham, former barrister, elected in 1983, I think. First of all,
unelected.
And then unelected.
By an ungrateful super punter.
Henry, I think you went on to become a Foreign Office Minister and current trade envoy to the Prime Minister.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And you, of course, have authored some work on House of Lords reform that you'll be presenting this evening. Over there we have Douglas Carswell, former MP for Clapton, for both UKIP and the Conservatives. You're, of course, a committed Democrat and long-time campaigner for constitutional reform, so glad to have you here with us. Over to my left we have Lord Flight, a member of the House of Lords. Remarkable business experience, I think 40 years in financial services, starting your career at Rothschilds, so a great deal of experience that you bring to the Lords, and a former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. We have, of course, Lord Robert Hayward down the end, a former MP for Kingswood, now a member of the House of Lords. I like to think of Robert as the Lord's very own sort of Renaissance man. You're a qualified rugby referee, former Deputy Chairman of the YMCA, well-known pastor. So no doubt been quite a lot to the Lords there. And finally, to my left, Henry Hill, Assistant Editor of Conservative Home, regular writer on all things constitutional and all-round parliamentary boffin, really. I think would be a fitting description. So, without further ado, let's start off with our speakers and their proposals. Henry.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, James. A great pleasure to be here, and also see at least one constituent in the audience. And thank you for all that you do to expose waste in the public sector and to come up with radical, dynamic ideas for giving the taxpayers better value for money. I suppose I'm partly the cause of this evening because I've done a paper along with someone called Jack Whirlidge on reforming the House of Lords, and I sent you a copy of the paper, and you said come here with various other people and discuss the proposals in the paper, and we'll see what we think about them. Now, my starting point is very simple. Where we are at the moment in politics, I think, is really quite scary. And the concern I've got is that if we don't do something quite soon about Lords reform, we could end up with, I hope to goodness, that with a new dynamic leader of the Conservative Party, we'll have a post-Brexit narrative, we'll have a great deal going for us, we'll come out of Europe by the end of the year, and we'll be able to devote attention to issues like this. But I want to grip this issue now, because I think if you have a look at the history of Lords reform in recent years, it's not a very happy one. I'm not going to run through everything, but you had the 1999 Act, you had the Royal Commission, you've had various white papers, you've had the coalition efforts, and you've now got a chamber that I don't think is giving the best possible value for money, and I think there is a need to reform it. Now, my proposals, I think they underpin the best of the current characteristics. They do offer a significant saving, and they are going to preserve expertise, and they're going to preserve also relative independence within the House of Lords, and they're also going to maintain the balance between the houses, which I think is between the chambers, which is incredibly important. So I would like to see the Lords reduced to 450 peers. They would be selected, elected, indirectly elected, on the basis of votes cast in the immediate previous general election, and each party would have an electoral college. Under these proposals, the electoral college would have independent members of it set up by statute, so it wouldn't just be made up of party apparatchiks, so it wouldn't become a disciplinary body as such. It would have an element of independence. But crossbenchers would have an independent electoral college as well, which in fact would be the House of Lords Appointment Committee, because that's already in place. And so what would happen is that they would be appointed by the electoral colleges in line with the percentage of votes cast. And in addition to the parties with a suitable threshold in place, you would then have, under my proposals, you would have 50 seats reserved for crossbenchers. They represent the people who don't vote in the general election. And they would again, as I mentioned, they would have their electoral college through the existing House of Commons Appointments Committee. You would, under my proposals, also have 15 seats reserved for the bishops and some other faith representatives. That could be decided. And you'd also have 10 seats reserved for senior members of the judiciary. These would be retired Supreme Court judges, because they don't now get a peerage upon appointment. So they would get it, they get a knighthood when they go to the High Court, they would get a peerage when they leave the Supreme Court, and they would be among the peers eligible to apply to an electoral college. So what would happen is that under my proposals, every member of the peerage would be able to apply to one or more of the electoral colleges. And that would mean life peers and hereditary peers as well. And it would solve very neatly the hereditary peerage situation, because people are saying that if you reduce the number of peers in the House of Lords, which is what the House of Lords Speaker is planning to do, down to 600 on a basis of 2 out, 1 in, at that stage the hereditaries would go up in percentage. Under my proposals, what you would do is you would actually break that link between the Prime Minister and his patronage, and so I'm going to legislate immediately. David Cameron appointed, I think it was 218 peers plus 15 in his resignation list. There were many people appointed who, let's face it, have turned up and not done a great deal. Some have taken leave of absence, and they're using their title to further their particular career in the city or wherever it might be. I think that link between the Prime Minister and immediate ability to legislate is something that we're increasingly losing public trust on. Under my proposals, what would happen is that the Prime Minister would say to our dear friend here, I'd like to give you something a bit more than a knighthood, it would be a peerage. And what that peerage will do, James or Henry, what it will do, it'll give you the opportunity to call yourself Lord Roberts or Lord Hill, and it would also give you the opportunity to apply to the Electoral College after the election. In your case, both no doubt applying to the Conservative Electoral College, and you would have the opportunity to apply. And the Electoral College, obviously, would have many applicants, including the hereditaries. So you would have a pool of talented people. And when people are going to turn around maybe and say to me, well, what you're doing is you're going to entrench the power of the whips and the powers of the party apparatchiks. What I say is you actually have a balancing mechanism of independence on the Electoral College. And furthermore, would you, in fact, rule out the opportunity to be able to sit for more than one parliament? No, you wouldn't. People who attended regularly and who delivered would go back to the Electoral College after a following election and apply again. So you actually would be building in a much more balanced, fairer system. No party would have control. Obviously, look at the pie charts of the elections even from 97 and 83, when in one case the Labour Party and in the other case the Conservative Party had a huge majority. You actually would, in the case of 83, very interestingly, you would have had probably, I think it was 18% as Lib Dem SDP MPs in the House of Lords. So my proposal, I think, is a radical way forward. It preserves the best of the House of Lords at the moment. It doesn't undermine the Commons, Mr. Chairman. It provides very good value for money. It saves a lot of money. And I think that it's a set of proposals that really does offer a way forward, and I would commend it to you.
I would abolish the House of Lords in its entirety. I don't mean to be unkind. Some of my best friends are peers. But I think on principle, it is absolutely wrong that those who make the law are not answerable to those who live under it. Even without taking into account the behaviour of the upper chamber over the past 3 years, I think the overriding democratic principle says we need to get rid of it. Since June 2016, I think the antics of their peers have brought forward the idea of abolishing the House of Lords and mean that it's pretty much unavoidable. Henry's absolutely right. We do need to act, and I think unless we act sensibly, we will leave it to others, to mad socialists, to act. But I think Brexit has radicalised suburban Britain to the idea of far-reaching constitutional change, and unless we get it right, it will be Corbyn's constitutional change rather than sensible constitutional change. The only reason the upper house, I think, has survived is because those who want to get rid of it haven't been able to find an alternative to the current status quo. Remember how Nick Clegg came up with the idea of a Senate. He, not so long ago, introduced this idea of reforming the House of Lords and changing it with an elected Senate. In doing so, he managed to come up with the one idea that was so utterly ridiculous and insane that he ensured the survival of the status quo. Under Henry's scheme, I think we need to think very carefully, under any scheme, we need to think very carefully what sort of people would be in the upper chamber if we reformed it. I fear that if we were to have an electoral college, if we were to reserve places for bishops, for people who live in palaces and who support Remain, if it's full of retired judges and ex-diplomats, how will it be different from what we have today? I think the people of this country deserve something better than an establishment chamber full of establishment orthodoxies and failed opinions. We don't want a chamber that is full of people who only ever meet real voters when they collect their dry cleaning. We need a proper upper chamber that actually reflects the views of the mass of people out there. So I would come up with a very simple system. I would get into line with Europe. I would copy the German system, where they have a Bundesrat. And the Bundesrat is drawn from local government. I would replace the House of Lords with a chamber, a second chamber, that was full of people co-opted from local government, local councillors, elected mayors where they existed. We need to have a revising upper chamber. I'm not a unicameralist. We need a revising chamber. And I think each county and each elected mayor could provide someone to sit in the upper chamber. Obviously, you have this dilemma. If you have an elected upper house, will it undermine the primacy of the Commons? Well, under almost any system of election, you have this problem. If you co-opt people from elected local government, yes, they have a democratic mandate because they've been elected to their local council, but they don't have a mandate that would challenge the primacy of the Commons. So you have a democratic system, but not one that undermines the primacy of the Commons. If you did this, if you co-opted people from local government into the upper chamber, you would create at the heart of our constitution a corrective mechanism to the overbearing centralisation. You would create a chamber with an inherently localist outlook right at the heart of Westminster, and that's long overdue. You would also, I think, and this I think would appeal to both Henry and me when he talked about the importance of reducing the costs, if you co-opted some of our local councillors to sit in the upper chamber and mayors, you would make sure that you weren't creating a whole new tier of politicians. So I think the idea of co-opting people from local government into sit in the upper chamber would solve many problems without the need for more politicians. Thank you.
I do hope Taxpayers Alliance is getting ready to get in there when the new leader gets chosen, and when you can help me policies right. Now, I think it's actually been correct that there hasn't been major reform of the laws, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and there are things that need addressing. But fundamentally, I think the Lords is better perceived by the electorate than the Commons, and so the sort of argument that the Lords is a sort of outdated mess is not the case. Its tasks are to review legislation and polish up poor legislation that comes through from the Commons, and on occasions to represent public opinion when it isn't being adequately represented in the Commons. It does this cheaply. Lords are paid, I think, about £310 a day if they turn up. There's no money, unlike the Commons, for secretaries and researchers, all the rest of it. And it's actually a remarkably cheap second chamber. Now, I'm not saying that everything is wonderful, and there is an issue about numbers of exploding, and particularly as political landscape keeps changing, they could explode even more. But what I observed is the most effective routes for reforming have been the various committees of the House of Lords itself, and in particular the Speaker's committee report on the size of the House, which, as I think already mentioned, is to get it cut back pretty quickly to 600 and possibly to less than that thereafter. But again, I make the point that about 500 turn up reasonably regularly, and to the extent there are another 300 actually appointed, they don't cost a penny when they don't turn up. So I think that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's been pretty wise that quite a lot of crackpot ideals and reform of the laws haven't been implemented. I think the issue of nomination is the most difficult issue, because it's all very well to criticise the Prime Minister, but I can see other bodies as rather worse than the Prime Minister in nominating who might sit in that second chamber. So I think that is a very difficult one to resolve. But otherwise, in terms of self-reform, it's how to manage the political composition following general elections, and that could change quite substantially in the foreseeable future. So you're going to have a whole lot of MPs cancelled, chucked out, or MPs, I shouldn't say, a whole lot of members of the Lords cancelled and chucked out, or you're going to phase it over a period of time. There's an issue about retirement, which I think, again, the Lords' own committees dealt with really rather well. Personally, I don't agree with compulsory retirement. Some of the most valuable contributors, like Lord Lawson, are well in their 80s, but I think where people have past their best, it's time for them to go, and that actually is now happening quite substantially. So I end up by saying, 2 in, 1 out, let the Lords committees get on with sorting out the practical problems, but we actually have a revising chamber which is, I think, remarkably well balanced in terms of its powers and what it does, and I'm slightly sceptical that any of the suggested changes are going to be any better.
I'm not sure whether we're in danger of agreeing with one member of the House of Lords with another, but can I just start with an observation from an excellent book, if you're talking about reforming the Lords, which is by Lord Norton, the constitutional expert in the House of Lords, who quotes Janet Morgan, who once observed, on summer evenings, possibly this evening, and winter afternoons, when they've nothing else to do, people discuss how to reform the House of Lords. Schemes are taken out of cupboards and drawers and dusted off. Speeches are composed, pamphlets written, letters sent to the newspapers. So we're doing precisely that. Can I say that the key issue here, Howard referred to it in passing, is in terms of the output of the Lords, and I think Henry's paper also acknowledges it, the output is actually not that bad. It's the input. How do we actually cope with the numbers and the content in terms of the appointments of the Lords? And I think that is something we have to address. In my industrial days, I was involved in taking organisations from bankruptcy and turning them around very, very quickly. And that is the objective as far as I'm concerned. You've got to admit there's a need for change. You've got to make those changes. But having said that, and the reason I argue for what I describe as Burns Plus, is there needs to be a moment of honesty. There are far too many members of the House of Lords. I cannot agree with them sitting there. Since I'm talking to the Taxpayers Alliance, I make the observation. Just imagine if there was a board of directors of 15 and only 10 turned up, but you'd say, oh, well, the other 5 don't matter because we don't pay them except when they turn up. The trade unions would have a field day. And equally, if the train drivers on the underground said, well, we've got 800 of them, but we only need 450, so we'll just leave them there until... Serious.
That's not the position.
Serious. I just make the point to emphasise it. It is not acceptable to say that we will stay as we are. But when I say Burns Plus, the Lords needs reforming. We have too many members of the Lords, we have too many members of the House of Commons, we have too many ministers, we have too many special advisors, and I don't know how many other people I've offended in the room by saying that in the process. I do notice one over on the far corner. And all notes of what Howard and I say are being reported back to the leader of the House of Lords later. But as far as I'm concerned, the important thing is that because change, as Henry indicated, any change in one form or another involves legislation. The important thing about the Speaker's report is that there is no legislative change necessary. You just feed it through on a 2 in, 1 out, 2 out, 1 in basis, maintain broadly the representation.
2 in, 1 out.
Sorry?
2 in, 1 out.
Yes, I did correct it. 2 out, 1 in. But and the bishops have actually accepted that they would adhere to that principle. I'm in present when they've said so. So it's and in fact the Prime Minister's letter acknowledged that in broad principle. And if the Lords works on conventions, and therefore if a convention were established that you would operate this as a target. And I'm assuming since you're all here, you've all read it in detail, so I'm not going to quote paragraph by paragraph, 1 or 2 shaking heads I see in the audience at the moment. But in broad principle, it says, let's take 2 out, 1 in, on a party basis, but don't do it on every election. Do it over a period of 15 years. And that is very sensible, because otherwise what you actually do is finish up with dramatic shifts after each general election. Let's assume, Douglas, that Brexit get a huge number of seats in the next election. There'd be suddenly a dramatic shift. There'd be the loss of the expertise from the previous House of Lords. So do it on a progressive basis. As a British people, we do things by stages, not by dramatic reform. And I would therefore this evening commend you to the Burns report, the Speaker's report, and say that we need to reform the House of Lords and reduce large numbers of other parts of our elected processes.
I am here to, if you like, expand upon Lord Flight's points and explain some of the, maybe the dangers of constitutional reform more broadly. I've been the constitutional correspondent of Conservative Home for 6 years, and the one thing that I've always noticed about every constitutional reform you care to name that we've attempted, whether be it devolution, be it the establishment of the Supreme Court, is that the sceptics are usually right. It never pans out the way that the reformers intend, and that is for the simple reason that with a constitution as complicated as the United Kingdom's, the number of interlocking parts, it is almost impossible in the abstract and in advance to work out what the impact of a change in one part of the system will be on other parts of the system. And I think that at a time when the United Kingdom is already in the grips of one of the biggest and most interesting political, constitutional sort of upheavals since the war, with Brexit calling into question the relationship between the executive, the legislature and the judiciary, and the Scottish Parliament and Westminster and Brussels and everything else, taking this on as well, this is about the worst possible time to do it. Maybe when things have calmed down a bit, but the idea of just we're doing lots of constitutional reform anyway, so let's just do this as well, is not the spirit in which I think that this should be embarked upon. I want to make one quick point about the size of the Lords. We on this side of the House do not accept that it's too big. The comparison, a most inapt comparison was made to TfL. If only TfL didn't pay the drivers that they weren't using, I think then the Taxpayers Alliance would have no complaint. The House of Lords is an excellent way of keeping expertise on retainer to the nation, and when they are not doing their bit in the Lords, that retainer is zero. Excellent value for money. So I'm going to address 2 dimensions of the House of Lords that we haven't touched on. First is the fact that any proposal which removes the Prime Minister's ability to directly appoint members to the upper house removes, effectively, the Prime Minister's ability to recruit outside talent to the Cabinet. At least so long as we maintain the British Convention that members of Cabinet must sit in the legislature. Now, at the moment, it is not the fashion to appoint members of the House of Lords to senior Cabinet posts, but I will just offer up that the period of time in which we've stopped doing that has at least correlated with a period of time in which Cabinet government has not covered itself in glory. And it might be wise for a future Prime Minister to dip their hand again into that vast reservoir of talent and potential that sits at the other end of the House of Commons. And the fact that this has not been addressed by any of the speakers we've heard, I think, highlights again the fact that there are so many unforeseen and consequences to any reform. The second point on the danger of an elected element, whether that be directly elected, whether that be co-opted, whether that's simply having the unelected balance of the House of Lords somehow reflect the balance of the nation in the general election, is that you must keep an elected mandate as far away from the House of Lords as you possibly can. It is stand in the gears of the upper house. Because we already see legislators, peers from certain parties who believe that that the House of Commons and first past the post are illegitimate, conducting themselves as senators, undermining the conventions by which the House of Lords operates. If the House of Lords were constituted on a basis that was more proportional, in their view, to the actual nature of the general election result than the House of Commons, that would only increase, and we would see increasing tension between both within the House of Lords, between those who are staying true to its proper purpose and those trying to suborn it, and then, inevitably, between the upper house and the lower house as the latter gradually came into the ascent. But the other danger of having an elected house is that, like the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, it would have its ferocious partisans amongst the B and C teams of British politics. But it would not do what it currently is intended to do. It would replicate the House of Commons. If you had any form of elected system, it would simply replicate the House of Commons that we already have, but it would be full of people who couldn't get into the House of Commons. It would be who the party put on their lists, the people they couldn't get over the line in first past the post constituencies. And as for the idea of using local government, people in local government, many councillors combine their council roles with full-time positions. The House of Lords often sits very late. It scrutinises a huge volume of legislation. I don't think it's at all obvious that it could be that those duties could be easily combined with the conscientious fulfilment of a local government role. But also, people in local government have, again, a completely different field of expertise. They need to know different things. They need to be up on your roads, on your planning application, on waste disposal, whereas members of the House of Lords need to know about trade policy and law and the Constitution. And the overlap between those two groups isn't huge. So I suggest that we're actually fairly well served by the House of Lords that we have it at the moment. Of course, the British Constitution, being uncodified, allows for incremental organic change of the sort that we are entirely in favour of on this side of the House. But please let us not, at this point in time of all times, embark on a bold scheme of reform. It won't work, and it won't do what we want it to.
Back around the panel, each of you will have 2 minutes to respond, and so that we can keep to time, I am going to cut you off at 2 minutes.
Okay.
So, same order. Henry, would you like to respond?
Well, just a few points. Douglas mentioned the calibre of councillors. Frankly, well, if you look around the country, you've got some pretty mediocre councillors. The idea that some of my councillors would become Lord so-and-so and so-and-so. Actually, I'm reminded of one of my favourite stories from Africa was when Prince Philip was with Her Majesty on a state visit to Ghana, and he was being shown around the Ghanaian Parliament by the Speaker. And he said to the Speaker of the Ghanaian Parliament, how many MPs do you have in this Parliament? And the Speaker said, we've got 320, Your Royal Highness. He says, a very good number. We got 655, and half of them are completely useless. So, as far as councillors are concerned, I don't think that's a great idea, and you talk about, Douglas, the localist outlook. I think on retirement, surely the key point about my proposals is that the Electoral College, you have a built-in mechanism there. So if someone is over 80 and they want to apply to the Electoral College, and the Electoral College think that they're of the right calibre and have got the right energy, then of course they'll be able to be selected. And likewise, as far as people of trying to tap into a pool of talent, if you bring in the registers as well around the country, you will have a massive pool of talent, many of whom won't apply, but those who do apply and then get elected, there will be a built-in driver for them to perform and to turn up and to do their stuff. And just on the one point that hasn't really been picked up, I think, Henry, I think you were too timid. of course there are unseen consequences in anything you do, there are risks. But on that basis, we wouldn't be trying to leave Europe. I mean, there's never a right time to do this. And I think we've got to try and somehow reflect the mood of the public out there. And we have a cherished institution. If we don't do something about it, we could lose it completely to a future government, and God forbid if it's a Labour government.
Thank you, Henry. Douglas.
Yes. I think there's a real danger that if you carry on behaving like Romanovs, you'll end up with Bolsheviks. And I think that the mood out there that Henry talks about is one that is incendiary. And yet here we are talking about whether or not we should replace the status quo with an electoral college. Do you imagine that people outside of the Westminster groupthink would be nominated by that electoral college to sit in this all-new upper chamber? Do you imagine that they will in any way, shape or form diverge from the groupthink in which the political elite in this country have been marinated for 40 years? Of course not. You're just simply going to replace a Tweedledee Tweedledum chamber with a Tweedledum Tweedledee chamber. We need radical change, and if we don't offer it, Comrade Corbyn will. We need to wake up. Now, people say that local government councillors are only part-time. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. They are only part-time. So they could quite easily sit in a revising upper chamber for part of the time. And the fact that they can't be there full-time is a positive. The state legislature of Texas only meets for, I think, 15 weeks a year and is all the more prudent for it. There's some suggestion that peers have a higher level of expertise than councillors.
They certainly do. My councillors.
Have you met some peers? I mean, I think yes, it's true that some peers are magnificent, and company in this around this table is esteemed. But there are some very good councillors. In fact, I know one or two councillors who also sit in the upper chamber. They're leader of local councils. It can be done. If you want people to stand for local government and people who can take responsibility and who are capable, offer them responsibility. Make it a big job. Allow Essex County Council or Kent County Council to nominate someone to sit in the upper chamber.
Not Lord Honeyfield, please.
Indeed.
On that bombshell, Douglas, I'm afraid we've reached 2 minutes.
No one's mentioned the committees in the Lords, which are generally more effective and wiser than the committees in the Commons, and I think quite useful for the Constitution. I sat on the Lords EU Economic and Finance Committee for 4 years. It's absolutely fascinating, and although obviously it had to have a spread of views, they were pretty sensible views. I think that does throw up the point that the whole idea of the Lords is to try and have knowledgeable people there, people that have had a lifetime experience in a particular area and therefore can contribute from a basis of substantial knowledge. And I think that very much is only achieved if people are nominated to the upper house than if they are elected. I don't deny there may well be some extremely able councillors. My wife's a councillor and I live in fear and dread. Some others have raised it, but I just want to repeat the point that I made, that I think that a hell of a lot of useful reform of the Lords can come from within the Lords itself, within the Speaker's Committee, and that's what is happening. And they're getting on with a sensible, practical reform, irrespective of what the sort of fancy stuff's going on at a national level.
What is striking when you go into the House of Lords is there is expertise on every subject. And if you talk to somebody like Michael Bates, who's been a minister in both chambers, he will tell you that he is subjected to more careful and informed cross-examination as a minister in the Lords than he ever was in the Commons, because there's an expertise on virtually every subject. Secondly, it's significant, and I'm the exception here, that we've got two former MPs, both of whom are arguing that we should in effect create a second house in one form or another that is more MPs. I'm sorry, you need to go to some different route. And therefore you need to maintain that expertise. And the risk of having some form of elected politicians from local government, the Bundesrat in terms of the state politicians, one of the problems with the House of Lords at the moment is it is too London and South East centric. And it's significant that Douglas just referred to Kent and Essex. He didn't refer to Cumbria or Tayside or Devlin or wherever. And that is the problem. We are a nation, and the Lords should be part of that and representative of the nation, but in a very different form. And as Douglas says, the expertise comes in the committees where we can contribute. And finally, just one thing, and this is a question that's genuinely raised, and it is a concern. How do PMs, when they need expertise, go about appointing it if you don't allow, if you block the system off? The report actually allows for ministers to be appointed by the Prime Minister on the limited number of occasions when that is necessary. So there is an allowance in the Burns report for that exception. So you stop the PM's patronage, except when they're making an appointment from the minister, as a minister. With those concluding comments, I think this makes sense. It's a conservative, non-legislative process, taken with a small c, and therefore well worthwhile.
I think it was most ungracious of Lord Hayward to open his initial comments with that very apt quote about the true nature of Lord's reform debates, because it has rather highlighted how much we've had to reach, I say we, how much the proposition has had to reach to try and justify the call to arms regarding Lord's reform. We've heard that the mood in the country is incendiary, that there is a sort of pre-revolutionary aura in the air, and yet, as any and every advocate of Lord's reform has to admit when pressed, there is no public interest in it whatsoever. Even in, I think, the introduction to Sir Henry's own paper, he concedes that there is very low public interest in House of Lords reform. In fact, I go further. I'd suggest that whilst there might be a genuinely revolutionary air in the country, as evinced by Brexit, the idea that the drivers of that are going to be assuaged or even remotely interested in Lord's reform is about as bubble a response as you can get. If you go out on the doorstep and somebody says, I'm ferociously angry, I voted for Brexit, I want things to change, and you said, well, excellent, here's my proposals for House of Lords. You could not look more like a Liberal Democrat, and you attempted the job. So that, I think, is the first point. And that brings us to the second, which is specifically, again, about the idea of co-opting local councillors. Now, it's true that many local councillors are part-time and therefore might have the time to serve in the House of Lords. But one of the great virtues of having part-time councillors is that it allows them to continue to work in what we in the bubble call the real world. They can have jobs in their local area, in the private sector, and bring that experience to local government. Now, it seems to me that if we were to suddenly take all these councillors and remove them from their normal jobs and make them instead sort of members of the House of Lords, we would instead merely have vastly expanded the bubble and removed from numerous councils all across the country people who have a living and useful connection to their communities and their industries, and replaced them with people who spend a decent chunk of their times up all night in the House of Lords. And I don't really see how that is a boon either for local government or, because of the already addressed and not rebutted complete lack of overlap, of expertise as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, look, that brings our debate to a close. The only thing that remains is for me to ask you to vote on the winning proposals. I'm not going to allow any electoral coalitions, so I'm going to ask you to vote for the panellists individually, and just vote by a simple show of hands, please. Please raise them nice and high so I can see. No, you can only vote once. Heads were a bit worried when a member of Parliament asked me that question. We'll start off with votes for Sir Henry Bellingham's proposal, please.
Sorry, can you vote for more than one?
No, sorry, you can only vote once.
Only one?
Only vote once. Okay. For Douglas's proposal, please.
25, 36,
Okay, for Lord Flight's proposal, please.
Well, actually, no,
Okay, for Lord Hayward's proposal, please. Okay, and finally for Henry's proposal, please.
Can we do Henry's...
Young Henry, don't start insulting me.
Henry's going to add up their votes.
No, they can't, I'm afraid. So we have a winner this evening. Our winner for our quickfire debate this evening is Robert Hayward. So well done, Robert.
I just say thank you, but it's actually the Burns Committee. It's the winner, not me.
Well, take the credit. And of course, these things are always a team game, so can we please show our appreciation for the rest of the panel? If you'd like what you heard, please do grab the panellists afterwards. There will be drinks, I believe, in the other room there. If you'd like to know any more about the proposals, you can email us at info@taxpayersalliance.com. I will endeavour to get you that info. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope you had fun.